with me back Lisa Jemmeson and Stephen Fisher from Jemmeson Fisher. They are the people that will get you out of trouble and help you make a profit, accountants and lawyers to the real estate industry. And Lisa, you were last week, like I was saying to you off camera, we had an extraordinary amount of engagement. Obviously, this is a topic that is trending. Like, people want to, really engage. And so, Lisa, we have had, so firstly, for those that didn't hear part one, Lisa is a litigation specialist for Jemmeson Fisher. And you've been right across. You've actually worked before for, is that right, for NCAT?
No, so I sit on their liaison committee, but we have a lot to do with NCAT in New South Wales and advising and representing agents. But similarly, we also do advocacy work for tenants as well. So we're not just one-sided.
Okay, so you're across everything that happened on the weekend. What is your take on it? What are the big things that you got out of what the government has said about tenants and landlords, resi and commercial?
Okay, commercial, first of all, you do have a framework there. So if you're own or you manage or you're a tenant in commercial property, you've got a framework that you can work towards in relation to rent waivers and rent reductions, and you've got mechanics there to protect you and keep people in businesses, because the government wants to avoid a situation where people are shutting up shop, because that has very serious effects for the economy. So that's good on that side, working through all that. Now, the residential packages are state-based, and so we have a variation across Australia. So as I understand it today, which is Tuesday, I think today, Tasmania is the only state that's passed regulation so far. New South Wales goes close. So when we spoke last time, we spoke about the Emergency Measures Bill, which was passed. All that did was give the Parliament the power to make regulation, and that regulation's in the Residential Tenancies Act. What we saw on the weekend was the state government, New South Wales state government, coming out and saying, this is what we propose and put forward. And then we saw the opposition come out and say, well, that's not really going far enough or good enough, and we want some things tacked on. But we don't actually have any regulation as yet. But I think there are a few things, Tom, going back to your question, that both sides are in agreement on. So perhaps we could talk about those.
Yeah, so let's talk about the things that we know, the things that Labor and Liberal have agreed to.
Yeah. So I think it's a priority for both sides of government to try and keep people in their homes and in their residential homes. And the regulations, as we understand them, in relation to hardship, so where people have been stood down or they've lost their job and they don't have the income that they once had, they will be protected by this new legislation. So the first thing is, if landlords or if agents have had tenants that have been chronic late payers, they're not necessarily going to be captured by this legislation, nor the protections that are within it.
So if you've been a bad tenant, that's a problem. If you've been a good tenant and you've had bad luck happen to you, the laws are there to help you.
Yes, that's right. And we see this on both sides of politics, and we're hearing it from landlords and tenants that everyone wants to do the right thing and look after people in their homes, but it's just the mechanics around it. So if we start at one end of it and we say, well, what's going to filter down from the top? You've got the state government saying, we impose taxes, levies rather, and so you've got state land tax. So we can control that. So if you're a landlord and you pay land tax, then we are going to give you either a waiver or a deferral of your land tax. But if we give that to you, you've got to pass it on to your tenant. Now, the problem that we've heard about from the opposition and from industry groups today is that's not going to capture enough people, because in essence, we've heard the figures from the opposition leader where she said it's 16% of landlords.
Right.
Because by the time you hit the threshold on your land tax, lots of landlords are mum and dad investors and just don't hit the threshold. Or you go out into regional areas and, you know, out of the city, you're just not getting up towards those figures. So there's 84% of people that are just left scratching their head saying, well, what do I get?
Yeah, because actually, you know, my own experience in real estate is very rarely do you have an owner of investment property having more than one. I mean, sometimes they've got two, but Lisa, it's generally one property. You know, they've dabbled and they've saved towards their retirement or towards the kids, and it's one property. And that doesn't get you over the land tax threshold.
Well, it doesn't, you're not paying land tax. So the relief that's been touted as residential relief for this market, just, it doesn't really go far enough. It doesn't go very far at all. And that's problematic because you have got people trying to negotiate and trying to come to arrangements, and they're not going to get that flow on effect. So that first is problematic. Okay,
so Lisa, what about this issue about if for the tenants that do have real issues? I think the talk was 20. If their income has gone down by 25% net, more than 25% net. So that's problematic for a landlord that owns one investment property, because if that tenant comes along and says, "Hey, listen, I've lost 4 shifts at my cafe. They get me to just make coffee in the morning for 2 hours, and I hand them out and I leave. I'm only getting 50% of my salary. My rent was normally $500 a week. I can only afford to pay you $250. Well, for a start, if your landlord is not paying land tax, they're not getting any concession. And then have they got a guideline on where they should negotiate to? Like, so you got a tenant that says $250, you've got an owner that says, you know, I've got to pay my mortgage.
Yeah, that's right. So there's not a guide, but what is really good, and I'd suggest to everyone who's watching, is to head over to the New South Wales Fair Trading website, because they give examples. And so they run you through. If you were a 2-income household and one income producer within the household's income drops, what happens in that scenario? And what happens if all the income drops? It runs through lots of different examples there. It also talks about, if you're a tenant, how do you go to your agent and say, my income's down 25%? What types of things do I need to do to take to the agent? So it allows tenants to get information as well to take to agents to have a look at. But what we keep seeing coming through, and the message is, parties need to negotiate in good faith. And we were talking earlier about the problem with, well, what's fair? Because this is a question framed a million different ways that we constantly get. The tenant was paying $1,000 a week or $1,200 a week, and now they've offered to pay $200 a week. What should I say to the landlord? Because the agent's stuck in the middle, and the landlord's saying, well, what should I do? And the agent's thinking, well, if it comes vacant, we're not going to get the same rent. How long is it going to be vacant for? Better to get something than nothing. We're doing this balancing act. So I think it's good that tenants need to look at, genuinely sit down and say, well, how much can I afford to pay? And then if an agreement can be reached between the parties, and remember, this is an agreement to pay an amount instead of the full amount that builds up over a period of time. The rent just doesn't go away, it builds up. But I think it's really important for property managers to show a tenant what that actually looks like over a 26-week period. We did an analogy today of an average 3-bedroom unit in Queen's Park rents at $1,200. And if a tenant was paying 30% of the rent, which is equivalent to 2 JobKeeper payments coming into that household, they'd pay close to $9,000 over a 26-week period. They've got this massive ballooning debt at the end. And that's that next hard conversation that we've got to have, which is, do you want to stay in this tenancy, or should we be talking about break fees and how they would operate, and having those conversations? So they're hard conversations to have with your tenants, and they're hard conversations to have with your landlords, but they're conversations we need to be having.
And Lisa, I mean, what's interesting is I actually think there would be a subset of tenants that would say, hey, I'm talking to you about not paying anything at the end. I'm talking to you about you giving me a clean discount per week now and not me paying anything at the rent. And that's even a harder conversation for a property manager, because that property manager's got to go there and say, listen, they're saying that you're never going to get this money. Which
there's nothing that I've seen, and I've done a lot of reading on different commentary because there's very little actually coming from the government. But if it gets to the end of the 6 months and you end up in NCAT, one of the things that the member's going to do is say, well, what negotiations took place and what did the parties agree? And if it's a situation where a tenant said, well, I just stayed there for 6 months and I didn't pay anything, I think it's open for us to say that that tenancy wouldn't be maintained. Now, that agent is still going to get an order on behalf of their landlord for the full amount that's outstanding. There's again talk today about agents not being able to list people on ticker, but I would imagine that if tenants didn't pay anything for the period knowing that they couldn't be evicted, that tribunal members would be reluctant not to give an order that a tenant could be listed. I think members are going to be looking to see that both the parties have acted reasonably and worked together and tried to resolve the issue and get them through to the period at the end, the 6 months, and then have a secondary plan in place as to paying the money off.
Now, if I'm correct, Lisa, I think the government has said that it is actually the law that the parties are seen to make an effort to negotiate.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, it's not the law yet, but it's a strong message, and the intention of Parliament is very important when we interpret legislation. And we're getting it from the government and the opposition. Everyone's saying the same thing. You must negotiate in good faith. You must try and do the right thing. And that goes back to what we were saying. Well, what is good faith? How much should we be expecting? What's reasonable to ask? And that's a conversation that you're going to have with individual tenants based on their circumstances. And if they're in a very expensive rental and they're going to have no prospects of paying this ballooning debt back, that's the time to have a conversation with, can we move you into something a little bit cheaper?
Yeah, and then you've got to make the commercial decision as well. Do you think you'll get significantly more rent, and how soon will you get a tenant coming into that property?
That's right.
So I have to say, like, it's a challenging time, Lisa, for people in the property management field. Is it worse at the moment, you think, to be a commercial landlord or a resi landlord, from what you know?
I think both are feeling it. Certainly, self-funded retirees are feeling it because they rely on that income. And one of the issues with self-funded retirees, they haven't really had much to do with Centrelink, so that if they're not receiving any money, this is likely the first time they've walked into a Centrelink office or tried to apply online to try and get some relief. Commercial tenants generally have landlords rather, generally have a little bit more buffer, and we use the term they're commercially competent, so that they generally know the ins and outs. So they're a little bit more sophisticated in some instances, so they may be able to weather the storm a little bit better. But I think until we have regulation, we just need to prepare. But property managers and landlords should have in their mindset the amount of rental property coming onto the market. And there were figures today in the Sydney Morning Herald that they quoted out of Domain. They were saying that rentals in Sydney are up 18% within 3 weeks. House prices are down, I think, $20 a week. Unit prices are down $30 a week. There's an estimated 14,528 vacant rentals. So it's up 845 properties since March. So okay, it's starting.
Yeah. Well, there's enough motivation for if you're a landlord to realise, hey, it might suit you to stick with what you've got there and cut a deal. In the meantime, Lisa, right now, the people that are going to be watching this over the next 12 hours, or those watching it live now, if you're a property manager, if you're a real estate agent, and you're rung up by a tenant now, we know that there's still, government's got to sign off on this. What do you say to a tenant at the moment? Scenario one is, I'm ringing up, I'm a tenant. Hey, listen, I've got problems with paying my rent. I've had a bit of unluck. I've lost my job. I've gone on a job start. Well,
Yep.
what's the conversation to that person?
Okay, so I think the first thing is that agents should get their approval to send back possibly their application form, which is the starting point of how they were accepted into that tenancy, because that's the
Yes.
starting point for income, so they can see it. A copy of their current rent ledger, so they can see exactly where they're paid to, because no one's spoken about this, and I'll say the dirty words now, but you know that I'm always 2 weeks rent in advance because I paid 2 weeks at the beginning.
Yes.
Soon we're going to have, but I know 2 weeks ahead. So it'd be a good idea to send the ledger out just to show them how that worked. And then either develop something within your agency or send them to the Fair Trading website and say to them, these are the types of documentation that the regulator is recommending that we request.
Yes.
Start there, try and get that information. If we need more, we'll come back, but we will work with you. Just one rider I want to say about the Fair Trading website. And first, I mean, they've done an amazing job to get information out so quickly, and it is really good information. But I did notice on there that they have put out to landlords and agents that you're not to issue a termination notice or evict a tenant. Now, the word we get from the landlord insurers is that the existing policies and processes have to be followed. So until you see regulation that says do not issue a termination notice, it's probably best practice to keep issuing them until you see the regulation. So you will see that on the Fair Trading website, so just put that rider on there. But otherwise, really good information. So start getting that out, or if the tenants are initiating the calls, which is fantastic, give them the information they need, tell them where they can get assistance. In this package from New South Wales, the Tenants Union got $2.3 million, which is great because they're getting smashed. You know, like the REIers and EAC and all our industry groups, same with the Tenants Union. So they're funded so that they can give assistance as well.
Okay. Now, if you're a tenant that is ringing up and being a little bit opportunistic, sounding out, and they just sort of say, hey, I just calling, you know, COVID-19 is going on. What can you do for my rent? What can you drop it by? What's the best response there?
You need to submit some paperwork and some figures so we can have a look.
Okay, perfect. So pretty much you're saying to people, give us the evidence and we can move from there, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you will get people that'll just say, look, I've got nothing to pay. I think in the wash of it, when it eventually gets before a member at the tribunal, that won't go down well. And that's not negotiating in good faith on the side of the tenant. But I think, you know, they'll be few and far between that will actually say, oh, look, I'm not going to do that.
There was one, I think Leanne said it to me the other day. She said, oh, the tenant rang up, said, oh, by the way, I'm letting you know I'm not paying any rent and I'm also bringing a dog into the property. See you later, and hung up.
Well, the dog is actionable. Right. So remember, these are carve-outs for financial distress caused by COVID-19. If they're damaging the property, threatening a neighbour or breaching the lease, all that is still actionable through NCAT.
Okay. So guys and girls, share that video, because I think if tenants see it, it's better that they're educated, and it's better if your owners are educated, because I think we've covered some basic common sense there. And I think part of this whole thing is having a bit of transparency for all parties, because if both parties know what's going on, but all of a sudden the middle person, life's a little bit more bearable, you know, for the person in the middle.
Yeah, 100%. Look, agents are doing a tremendous job. Because they've never had to face this before. They haven't been trained for it. And a lot of property managers, although, you know, we teach salespeople scripts and dialogues, that doesn't necessarily flow through to property management. So there are people that have never done this before having very hard conversations with landlords and tenants that are highly emotive And in my experience, property managers are doing a tremendous job out there. And everyone just needs to keep doing that, working together and trying to resolve it. But we need to wait for the regulations. And that's in every state. You need to wait to see what actually gets through Parliament. That's really important. So don't pick a form. And we've been providing to our clients a payment plan form, which states where tenants can get more information, that states it'll be handed up at NCAT if it goes all the way. But what I like about it is it says over 26 weeks, if you pay this amount, each week, this is how much it builds. Because when a tenant gets to look at it and say, I'm going to owe how much at the end, maybe that changes. Maybe they pay a little bit more where they can actually see what that means. And that's really
Yeah, beautifully said. So, and if you're not a client of Jemmeson Fisher, I can tell you they're being outstanding in the last few weeks. Your husband's been outstanding even prior to that with all the stuff that he's done for me. But you guys are sort of putting yourself out there, a bit of community service, and reach out to them. Now, I was going to ask you, and you might answer it, or you might bring. Oh
no, young Stephen's here. I've got the bean counter ready to go.
Okay. Yeah,
Come on.
So thank you so much. We'll speak soon,
right,
Lisa. Hey, Steve, how you going?
Good, Tom. How are you?
Very, very good. I did get your email the other day saying that you thought the highlight was Lisa being on the video. Yet, Steve, I've got to tell you, I've got a lot of people, a lot of real estate business owners asking me. And by the way, everyone, Lisa was talking about New South Wales. Steve's probably going to touch more on a national basis. And you know, there's concern about the JobKeeper allowance because, and I'm going to read out a text message that came through, which signifies the confusion, where it's got hi Tommy, the job seeker, they refer to a 30% decrease in March or April. So there was an article in the Australian paper that said that you needed to have a decrease of 30% in March or April of invoices. I cannot get an answer from where an invoice is generated in real estate. Is it at settlement? Is it at exchange? Are you hearing anything, Tommy? Agents generally invoice on exchange, but we lodge income on our BAS from settlements. And then the other part of it, Stevie, is that, like, even though COVID-19 has been going on for a month or two, or a month, say, you know, in real estate, what happens is a lot of them had a good March. Like, they still sold properties in March. The real pain point is going to be low exchanges, low sales and low listings in April and May, and that'll probably end up being bad settlements in June and July. Yeah, what's your understanding of JobKeeper and, you know, the periods that you compare?
Okay, so the critical criteria is to go back to, if we look at April, May, June 2020, this quarter, we need to compare this quarter to the same quarter last year. So I always tell all my clients our starting point, and in answer to the text that you receive, it's based on what's on the BAS. So what the ATO will be doing, they'll be looking at the BAS that you are comparing it to last year and saying, these are my forecasts for April, May, June 20. Have I got a 30% decrease? So if I lodge my BAS, June 19 BAS, and it's got $1 million in income, PM and sales, if I can do my calculation for April, May, June, and I can do that calculation now, which includes actuals and forecasts up to May, June. If I can do that calculation now and I'm satisfied my income will be 700K compared to last year's 1 million K, I've just met the criteria to be eligible for JobKeeper, and I can opt in now.
Right. So I get it. So what you're saying is, for the April, May, June, based on what you know, you can have a forecast. You can say, I'm forecast to hit 70% versus 100% for the same quarter last year.
Exactly. So if you, and I've had this conversation over the last week with a number of clients who have said to me, the same point you raised, my February and March sales were quite good. I am only seeing now the income flow through in form of settlements, which then goes on to my BAS. I can't tell you now that I am going to have the 70% or 30% reduction in turnover for this quarter. And my response is, well, if we have this same conversation in early May, mid-May, end of May, you may well have a different view as to whether or not you become eligible to be part of the system. If you do, you register at that particular point where you've satisfied the criteria that you've got a 30% reduction. Whether that be now, May, June, July, August, doesn't matter. As soon as you reach that point where you satisfy that criteria, you suddenly become eligible to be part of the JobKeeper subsidy. It's not backdated because you only became eligible when you hit that 30% reduction in turnover.
Right. Okay. So if you're sitting, so what you're saying, let me get this right. So if at the moment you've had a decent January, February, March in sales, and let's assume that you've even had you're going to have good settlements in April, you won't be able to, am I reading this? Am I hearing you right? You won't be able to actually apply till May?
So if you're flowing through with a good March quarter, your April settlements are coming through because you've had all your efforts the previous few months. If you are not satisfied that you're going to hit 30% reduction, wait.
Yeah.
But if you say to me, Steve, my current set of listings show that I am going to have an awful May and an awful June, and my sales are just going to decline significantly, which will more than cover the 30% reduction in turnover for the quarter, then you should be opting in.
Okay. And I think that, without me generalizing, I would say most people are going to be in that situation because real estate between buyers and sellers there's been a bit of a pause button set at the moment, right? There's no indication that there's going to be massive amounts of sales happening or regular amounts of sales happening in the next month or two.
That's correct. And we've got until the end of April before we decide to opt in from the beginning of April. So we still have another 2 weeks to do our calculations, to see how our listings and our appraisals, listings, sales are going. If our list is dropping off, we may well be clearer in 2 weeks' time. My turnover is significantly now being affected. I can see easily that these forecasts that I have for May and June will well and truly make me eligible. Others are saying, at this point, I have settlements that are coming through which compare quite favourably to last year at this particular time. I don't think I'm eligible yet. I may well be. So I just say, well, let's just keep doing the calculation, keep doing the cash flow forecasts. The minute you qualify for that 30% reduction in turnover, that's when you opt into that scheme. Okay.
Anyway, anyone that's been listening on here and they're not getting any clear sense coming from their own accountants, reach out to Steve. Like smart business people, they're going to do what I'm trying to do, and that is grow market share in a time of crisis. As Rupert Murdoch used to say to me, Steve, a couple of times I've sat through meetings I presented to him when I was at News Corp, he'd say, "You never waste a great crisis." Anyway, I want to thank you both. Outstanding. You've both been run off your feet. I can imagine you've been run off your feet, and you're serving the real estate community very well. We're going to have you on. Like, you know, what's happening right now, Lisa and Steve, is that the speed of change. Like, you know, we used to have the weekly news, the daily news, the hourly news. It's changing a lot. People are struggling. They're grappling. But you guys are doing a superb job keeping people informed. I want to thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Anytime, Tom. Talk soon.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
See you later,
Bye.
Steve. See you, Lisa. Bye-bye.